Scott now works for the Atlanta Botanical Garden and managed their International Plant Exploration Program, which began in 2016. He's from Georgia and is the former owner of a very cool nursery called Gardenhood, but his passion is plant collecting and propagation, and it sounds to me like he's landed his dream job. So Scott, with that, I will hand it over to you so you can tell everyone more.
Very good. Thank you so much, both Julie and Mandy, for inviting me. It is my pleasure to be here this afternoon. So as Julie said, for the past almost 5 years now, I'm back at my second stint with the Atlanta Botanical Garden, managing the International Plant Exploration Program. My job focuses mostly on Southeast Asia. We work quite a bit in China and Vietnam, mostly, with a little bit of work done in Northeast India. And so today I would like to talk a little bit about one of the conservation projects we're working on in southern Vietnam, which is a little bit out of our typical range of exploration, but I think you'll hopefully see why we do that here shortly. So the tree that we're going to be talking most about today is called Pinus krempfii, or krempfii pine, found only in one spot in southern Vietnam in what's called the Central Highlands of Dalat. I have been traveling to Vietnam for since about 2007 was my first trip. And for the past 4 or 5 years, we've been going back 2 or 3 times a year to focus on multiple kind of research and conservation projects we're working on with magnolias, orchids, conifers, and now lilies. So in, spring of 2018, I had traveled to Vietnam, typically where we fly into Hanoi in the northern part of the country there, and our typical route is basically up here right along the Chinese border. So we had spent about 2 weeks in this area. I had still maybe 4 days or so left on my trip, and I had been reading about these pines that occur in the southern part of Vietnam for several years, but had never really had the opportunity or time to go down and see them. So when I was talking to my host, Dr. Zhu, and explained to him that my desire to go and see them, we decided to leave the north a little bit early, drive to Hanoi, and then flew down to Dalat. So we arrived there. I was able to meet with the dignitaries there of the Bidup Nubai National Park, where these pines occur. We spent a day with them looking at these very large trees. Getting to know each other. They asked me lots of questions about what we wanted to do in this area, why we were interested in these trees. They're very protective of these particular pines. Many of them are approaching 2,000 years old, and the only known specimen living outside of Vietnam is in the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew of Edinburgh, Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh. And a friend of mine is a curator there, and when asked if a natural disaster were to occur, what is the one plant that you would go and bring out of that particular garden? Pinus krempfii immediately came to the tip of his tongue. So it's an extremely rare plant that all plant nuts and conservation enthusiasts really realize that something needs to be done to preserve these things. So the problem was they're having trouble with regeneration with the seed in these plants. These trees are quite large. They occur in basically a tropical forest. And the area where the seed is dropping is a good, rich forest floor. However, the Pinus krempfii are so very large, and they're actually lifting up the soil from the base of the forest floor, causing large air pockets to occur underground. So as these young pine seedlings emerge, they're fine for the first couple of years, and then they send down a taproot. Once the taproot hits that air pocket underground, it immediately burns the tip of the root off, and almost always these seedlings die. So we were there. The idea was to hopefully collect seed and work with them on how to propagate these seed or germinate these seed, and then get them planted back out in the national park there. It is an IUCN listed tree. It is listed as threatened, so it is not on the most critical category yet of plants to go extinct. However, we like to work with things prior to getting that close to being wiped off the planet. So now, flying into Dalat, it is the Central Highlands area, as I mentioned. It is known in Vietnam as being sort of a a very temperate area. So many folks from the lowlands, where it's so sweltering in the summertime, will go up to Dalat to spend a few days, a long weekend or something, to get away from the heat and humidity, because it is just a beautiful temperature there most of the year. It is definitely a subtropical area. However, the mountains around it raise this area up to about 3,000 feet. So it gets nice cool breezes at that high elevation. And being a fairly close proximity to the ocean, the temperature is regulated by that. And what you're looking at now is just outside of Dalat. So on our way, Dalat city is in a bit of a valley, and then we drove for about 2 hours to get up to the Bidup Dubai National Park. On the way, we passed basically two different kinds of landscapes. There are cemeteries everywhere, and then there are polyhouses, both of which you're looking at in your screen there in the foreground. There are headstones that basically surround the outside of this nursery area, and then in the background you see just hundreds, if not thousands, of polytunnels that go up and over the hill in this area. So the growing season here is extremely long. They focus on growing cut flowers. Vegetables basically are their largest two crops, and they're just now starting to get into orchid production as well. Most of these cut flowers go all over Southeast Asia, whereas the vegetables and crops are usually kept mostly to southern Vietnam. So driving up past all those polytunnels with not a single tree, I was really quite concerned what we were going to see when we got up to this national park. However, it has been quite well protected. And as you can see here, this is the sign at the gate as we go in. Visit Bidup Dubai National Park. Leave nothing but footprints. Take nothing but photographs, and kill nothing but your time. Great words for us all to live by as we hike in these areas. So one thing that perhaps you will notice is quite stark contrast from forest services we work with in China are the funding in Vietnam is abysmal. Basically, they are dependent upon government funding, which is virtually nil. So the Bidup Dubai National Park is the third largest national park in Vietnam. It's about 170,000 acres, and is managed by about a dozen park rangers. And their main job is to try to protect these areas from poaching. And they do this by constantly going through on motorbikes on the roads that go through these forests, just scouting and looking for fires, looking for logging poachers. The government does allow them a small stipend. There are villages throughout this national park. And so the park rangers are allowed to give small stipends to villages, which basically encourages them to radio them or telephone the rangers if they are to see poaching going on in this forest, which is about the only way they can keep up with such a large area. But the whole community is aware of the amazing ecosystem that still is intact in this area, and so they're quite determined to preserve it. So what we're looking at here is the forest rangers. They're basically their headquarters. So we go there, meet with these guys, and kind of decide on where we're going to go from here. The trees themselves are not very difficult to get to at all. It takes only a few hours of hiking to get to these trees. We can drive virtually up to the valley where they're occurring, and then hike up into the area. So in the spring of 2018, I made my first trip. Then in July, after I'd left, gotten back home, I got an email in July from my friend Dr. Zhu from the Academy of Science, who took me down to Dalat, saying that the forest rangers that we had met with earlier in the year were impressed with our goals and objectives and had offered to issue me a permit to come down and collect seed of the pine if I would like to do that. So I was ecstatic to receive that information. I got in touch with the American Conifer Society. The Atlanta Botanical Garden has a good relationship with the Atlanta branch, at least of the American Conifer Society, and I sent them a proposal asking for a small amount of money that would allow me to bring down several researchers from Hanoi down to Dalat to look at not only the conifers that are there, but also several rare magnolia species that occur there. They very graciously awarded me a $2,000 grant, which allowed me to pay for all the expenses for the researchers from Vietnam that came down with me, which I am very grateful for. So on this particular return trip, I also invited a good friend of mine, Dr. Peter Zale from Longwood Garden. Peter is a orchid enthusiast, and I would go so far as to call him an expert, certainly, especially on propagation techniques when it comes to tissue culture, growing off and germinating seed of very difficult to grow plants. So Peter was quite interested in coming with me, not only to see these ancient trees, but also to see what kind of orchids occur in the understory along this area, which are quite numerous, actually. So I'm standing in the center there, and then looking at your screen to my left with the maroon shirt and the vest on is Dr. Nam. He is the national magnolia expert for Viet Nam, working for the Academy of Science. The two young guys left of him are climbers, and then the fellow to my right there with the yellow hat is the head of the forestry department, Peter Zale, all the way down. And then next to Peter is Dr. Zhu from the Academy of Science, who helped organize this entire project. So we were first taken to the backside of their office building there, where they showed us two small seedlings that they had transplanted 3 years ago. They know that they must get the seedlings out of the forest if they have any hope in regenerating. And so they started evaluating these plants in different light exposures. In the forest, of course, these plants grow as an understory plant in a very dense jungle. So the shade that they receive for much of their juvenile life is quite intense. And the idea, this pine is very unusual. As you can see, it has large flat needles. And so one of the theories is that this particular pine is at the convergence, basically, of the Podocarpus family and the pine family, because what you have here are long, broad needles that are able to effectively photosynthesize in very dark environments and understory environments, very much like Podocarpus. However, instead of the aril or the red berry that Podocarpus, or the fruit that Podocarpus produce, this particular pine produces a cone, just like any other pine. Its closest relative actually is the white pine, based on genetic evaluation. However, as I said, it acts like, based on its photosynthetic response, very much like a podocarp. So it is a bizarre tree indeed. And so what they're finding is that these plants can thrive in full sun situations once they're pulled out of the forest. And in fact, they begin to cone at a much younger age. So just to kind of give you an idea of what the foliage looks like on the young plants. Here, the needles are fairly short. This plant, as I said, is about 5 or 6 years old. The 1-year seedlings, the needles are about 4 or 5 times as long, to help, again, absorb as much of the sunlight as they can to get them up to the canopy. Eventually, these trees become an overstory tree. So as they shoot up and grow, they push themselves through the canopy and will eventually stand out above absolutely everything else, which makes them fairly easy to spot from a distance. And here you can see the cones emerging. Like many pines, these cones take 2 years to mature. This is a 1-year cone that is just forming. So after 2 full years, that cone will mature and produce viable seed. And to just give you an idea of the forest as we could see it from our vantage point, we were taken to this hilltop, and our guide had binoculars and was looking out over the jungle there, and could see where we needed to go to find the largest trees. And at first I was looking at this picture thinking, I really don't, it's like you don't know how to read. You are looking at the same picture, but you're not getting the same information out as your colleagues are there. So he began to point out to me, which were the pines and which were the other plants that were growing in this area that were interesting, but maybe not our necessary objectives. And so now as we come in a little closer, perhaps you can start to see, so these Pinus krempfii, as they grow, as I mentioned, they become the overstory. And so they also become almost this large bonsai-looking plant where they have a flat top, and then the branches begin to kind of go out, very short and kind of stout branches that come out. So you can see a little bit of these in the middle. Here's one here, here's one over here, here's one over here. But then as we take just a little bit different perspective, then it makes it much easier for you to be able to kind of see where these are. So, these 3 trees in the top are the Pinus krempfii. So once we identified these things, we obviously are not that far from them. We were able to just on foot go in and hike into the base of these trees. But we wanted, as I mentioned, to look also and take time to study somewhat of the flora that occurs in the understory of this area. So we were able to find many different species of orchids actually in flower, even though this is in the beginning of December of 2018. These calanthes are in full bloom, which obviously tells us that this is a fairly tropical area. But our theory is that these trees are so old, most certainly they have some genetic hardiness in them. So while these plants have not been evaluated necessarily outside of Vietnam out of doors, we hope that perhaps the theory is that they could have some hardiness to them, just as this orchid perhaps does. It is also growing in an area with an extremely desirable fern called Rotoliya. This is a very rare, ancient sort of a fern. It looks very much like another fern called Dipterus, and Dipterus is considered the holy grail for fern enthusiasts. And this was my first time coming upon this Rotoliya, which looks very much like it. It's an evergreen fern on very thin, wiry stems with this kind of split leaf there, as you can see. So we're able to bring back small pieces of this, and unfortunately, as with the Dipterus, there is some sort of a mycorrhizal relationship going on there that you just cannot mimic without actually bringing some of that soil back with us, which we are not able to do, of course, at this point. So until we can get spores off this guy, we're not able to collect that one. Also, an interesting maple that occurs there is called Acer Tonkanense. It is a palmate type maple that again was blooming in a very off season. This was in late December. This was only one tree that was flowering, so I have a feeling it was just aberrant blooms, but still you can kind of get the idea of how ornamental maples can be in bloom. These flower spikes are about 6 or 8 inches long. And then another companion plant that perhaps you are familiar with is Rotoliya. This is Rotoliya Championii. So this is an evergreen relative of the witch hazel family. Even for us here in the southeast U.S., this blooms fairly reliably around January, February, and a bit earlier, as you can see in its native habitat there in southern Vietnam. This plant has enormous range of nativity going from the southern tip of Vietnam all the way through China. So provenance on this particular plant is quite important if you want to try to get it to grow in your area. I feel like it would be fine in Philadelphia based on the collections that we've made from Chinese plants, and we're having very good luck, as I said. We've got 15 or 20 foot plants now in Atlanta that are blooming. So very excited to have this plant. And as I mentioned, this is, while it is from southern Vietnam, the idea that this plant grows with this Pinus krempfii gives us hope that perhaps it can take some cold. So this is Dr. Nam looking at Magnolia bidupensis, named after the national park that it grows in. There are 3 magnolias in this national park that have never been propagated or studied outside of the park. And so this is part of a large magnolia project, an international magnolia project that Atlanta Botanical Garden is working on. And this area in Vietnam is loaded with unusual species that need further studying, certainly. And a couple of conifers that perhaps you'll recognize that grow with these pines. This is Phokinia hagensii, which again does very well for us here in the Atlanta area, depending on the provenance it was collected from. Very nice, flattened, shiny green scales on the underside of that, and beautiful white stomatal bands that help it photosynthesize in dark, shady areas. But just a fantastic, slow-growing, very long-lived conifer that grows side by side with this pine. And Decredium. Now, this plant is not hardy for us at all in Atlanta, but it is intermixed between these other conifers that are growing. This is Decredium Elatum, a beautiful, rare conifer that occurs in this part of Vietnam. That again, we have good luck growing in our conservatory, but it's not going to take any sort of cold, I'm afraid. And then finally, after walking for several hours, our guide pointed to the ground and said, "This is Pinus krempfii." And while I had seen those over and over again, I assumed, just like the rest of our group, that this was a podocarp of some sort. We just weren't seeing any large specimens. But you can see how long these needles are compared to my hand. I mean, some of them are approaching 12 inches long, just about, this very juvenile form. So this plant would be probably 2-ish years old, growing in the understory there, underneath the larger trees. And so bringing it out into the sun, you can see it almost immediately makes those needles start to become shorter and sturdier, a little bit, not quite as dark green, but the plant then grows at a much faster rate. It's much more dense as a youngster and becomes a larger tree quicker with more light, of course, as you would imagine. So just this slide I threw in here just because I don't really have another good shot of the breadth of the base of one of these trees. So on a third trip, I went back with Greg Page, who many of you I'm sure are familiar with, and my friend Peter. We were back there just this past December, in December of 2019, again working on collecting seed. But this, I wanted to insert this particular tree is called the BBC tree. So the British Broadcasting Company did a documentary on this tree because it is thought to be one of the oldest in the park, coming close to about 1,800 years old. They cored these trees, a handful of these trees, about 30 years ago. But since then, not much work has been done to guess the age on several of these. So they're guessing these great granddaddies are anywhere between 1,800 and 2,000 years old. And you can see what I was saying about how the trees lift the ground to some degree. Where Greg is sitting is the root collar of that particular pine. And so typically where Greg is sitting at his belt line basically is where the soil levels should be on a plant that is, you know, growing in a typical landscape. This tree, just because it's lived there for so long, the erosion has caused some of the soil to wash away. It has upheaved some just with these massive roots. As you can see, these giant buttress roots literally pushing it out of the ground. And there are air pockets behind his orange backpack there. There are these caverns you can see, almost light coming through when you look underneath there. So, you know, these trees are not going to survive another 1,000 years, certainly. And so they're concerned about what will happen eventually. But what can you do to try to prevent this from happening, other than try to propagate youngsters from these large trees and try to learn about where they best would like to survive. So just to give you an idea, that is one of the largest ones, called the BBC tree. Looking up from the base of it, just magnificent trees. It would take probably 3 grown men to get your arms around the base of some of the larger trees, maybe 4. These trees typically are about 150, 180 feet tall. You can maybe get an idea there. The lowest branches occur maybe 50, 60 feet off the ground, something like that, before they start to, you know, produce their canopy on these older trees. So the task was to collect seed, and trying to figure out how we were going to do that. I asked, you know, our guide what would be the method of doing this. I didn't know if they had some sort of a slingshot or a rifle or how we were going to do this. And when we were in the office there of the forest ranger, I asked him that question. He disappears for a second, and I hear this dragging along the tile floor, and he pulls out this giant teepee, sort of a pile of climbing rope, and he said, this is how we do it. So on the way up that day, I pointed out a couple of climbers that were standing beside me in that group photo. We drove through a small village and picked up 2 guys. We drove in. My guy, Dr. Zhu, got out. He went and talked to a few people. Several people obviously told him hell no, but a couple of people said yes, we'll come and try and do it. So they got in our car. We drove up to Bidup, Dubai, and they were to be our climbers for the day. They had experience doing this before. However, they were climbing much smaller trees. So it took us a little bit to figure out how to get started. And so we had porters carry all this rope in, which is quite heavy, and a little bit of climbing gear. There is a harness this gentleman has here, you see, and he is actually going to try to use tree spikes to climb up this tree, which is not really a method that we use here in the U.S. anymore because of the damage it does to the tree. However, this is the method they use to get up these sometimes in order to test the canopy. So he is using spikes, and then we'll use the rope, you know, to kind of shinny up the side of that tree. At least that was the plan. So he started down at the bottom, and it took him about 30 minutes to get about 15, 20 feet up. The trees are so large, the diameter is so large, and the amount of rope that he has to carry with him and then fling up just with his arms. By the time he got to the height you see there, he was coated in sweat and just completely exhausted, and he hadn't even made it, 1/10 of the way up the tree yet. So he slid back down, and we decided we had to figure out another strategy for getting these seed out. So we loaded up, the porters loaded all the rope back up. We hiked back to another tree that we had seen earlier in the day that had a vine growing on the side of it, and this turned out to be the key. So as our porter gets all the stuff out of his basket, he's pulling the ropes out and everything. This other climber sees that there is basically a jungle ladder leaning up against this large pine. He clips a rope to his belt buckle. He has no harness of any sort. They don't have a climbing harness for this. And before we could even suggest he, try to use some other form of safety precautions, he was already 15 or 20 feet up in the tree. And within 20 minutes, he was in the canopy of the thing. Really pretty amazing. So as I backed up, as I wanted to be able to get some shots of him actually collecting the seed, so I climbed back up to a higher vantage point, and the tree you're looking at now is the tree that is this tree from a distance. And the cones of these things, as you can probably guess, pine trees don't produce cones conveniently near the trunk, and so they always produce flowers and cones out on the tip ends of these very long branches. And so in order to get the cones, our buddy's going to have to not only climb this tree, but he's going to somehow have to knock some of these cones out. So a little bit closer of a zoom in, perhaps you can see him right here in the tree. So I'm going to back up one more time and show you where he is. He is right here in this tree. So he has climbed this tree is way down in the valley. In the time it took me to climb out of that hole, he had gotten all the way up to this point basically and was getting ready to figure out how we could start collecting seed for us. So I had zoomed my camera all the way out, and you can see he is belayed in on his jean belt buckle there, which provides zero support while he's up there, other than perhaps makes him feel a little bit better. But he did tie off to a tree, but had he fallen, it just would have ripped his pants off, not saving his life, unfortunately. But the weather was okay during this time, and so he was an experienced climber. He made it down alive, fortunately. But just a few shots of what he was doing up there. The pine, of course, is in the foreground. In the background, you can see a larger leaf, and those are rhododendrons that are growing up in the crotches of these trees. So as you probably can guess, 100 feet off the ground is a whole nother ecosystem going on up there. Plants that are distributed via air, or birds perhaps drop them when they're roosting up in these trees. But in any case, these trees that are extremely old, in the crotches, they collect all of this debris, and it makes for very fine garden soil. And so eventually you have kind of a garden amongst the canopy of these trees, which is kind of what you see in the background there. So what he's doing, he's shinnied out to the end of the branch, and he used his machete and just chopped off quite a few of the end branches there that had cones on them. So for an extremely large tree, you can see that the cones are not all that large. And again, this was in probably the second week in December of 2018. So we were able to collect, these are all the cones we had. We spent an entire day, 2 days actually, trying to collect this seed. This was the seed we had. We had, after prying them open with a knife, we had about 60 what looked like very viable seed. Unfortunately, all but 2 of those floated, which, the float test is a pretty good way of telling whether or not there's air inside that seed pocket, or excuse me, the seed coat. If so, the embryos probably either shrank down significantly or completely rotted. However, we didn't want to give up, and we brought the seed back. We divvied the seed up between myself and Peter, and got back, and sure enough, we had one of the viable seed. So it germinated in just a number of weeks. Peter never had any germination whatsoever, unfortunately, on his. So perhaps we only had one viable seed out of all of that. And while I would love to end the story here, sadly, about 2 months after I took this photo, this young seedling ended up damping off. Now, we had only this one germinated, unfortunately. So we struck out for a second time there in December of 2018. So in 2019, just this past December, Greg Page, Peter Zale, and myself went back. It was my third time back trying to get this seed. And this time we went just a few weeks earlier. So we tried to go in between, right before Thanksgiving is when we went this past year in 2019. But again, they had severe droughts in Viet Nam, and while we it was great to visit with our colleagues there, and they invited us back once again, we came home completely empty-handed. So that I'm going to call my second attempt. My first attempt at seed was just meeting people with zoo, and then I went down with Peter and Greg, and so I'm hopeful that my third time collecting seed will be the charm, which we will hopefully get back and do next year sometime. But until then, this Pinus krempfii sadly has eluded us. So that is my story on the amazing Pinus krempfii, and it looks like we still have a little bit of time. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any of those. I see Julie has popped back up.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It's so fascinating, and I want to thank all of the members of the American Conifer Society who I think a lot of you joined in today, and so that was really neat to see that you guys shared that link with each other. So I'm sure this was really fascinating for you to listen in on. So, but you just have so many cool stories of all the places you've been. So I know there's one question in here, so I'll let Mandy read that to you.
Hi, Scott.
Hey.
That was really interesting.
Thank you.
So it's a great question. How long do seeds and live samples have to be in quarantine before they can be introduced to U.S. soil? Are there regional or USDA or other government agency quarantine facilities?
Yes. So permitting is important. It is paramount, really, when we do these sorts of things. So we have what is called a small lots of seed permit, and that basically allows us to collect research amounts of seed, 50 seed or less of any particular collection. So we're not over there collecting for nurseries, for example, and collecting thousands of seed or pounds of seed. So we're allowed to collect small amounts of seed that we use basically for research and evaluation. We have a very close working relationship with the USDA and Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service in Atlanta here at the Hartsfield Airport. So all of my seed I ship directly to them from Vietnam. It goes directly to them in a few days. The box itself is quarantined until they open it, and depending on what the plants are inside, different plants have different requirements. For the most part, seed is okay because they x-ray the seed to make sure that there are no insects or pathogens inside the seed, so they can see that it's clear, and they can visually inspect the outside of the seed coat for fungus or drilled holes or anything like that. So by and large, seed is fine. Plants, though, many plants do require up to a 2-year quarantine. And so we work with the U.S. National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. They have a facility there that if we have oaks, for example, if we were to bring in live oak plants, either cuttings or plants with roots, I would have to ship them up to the National Arboretum. They would grow them on for me in a controlled greenhouse setting by the USDA, and then they would be released to us after 2 years of very careful inspection and evaluation. But there are just a handful of plants that are that serious, and it's mainly because they are hosts for things like, perhaps you've heard of sudden oak death, and the Dutch elm disease, certainly we've all are familiar with. So things like that, of course, they're trying to prevent bringing in. And as I say, every time I give this lecture, while I'd love to have the next magnolia or conifer named after me or one of my daughters, I do not want the next honeysuckle or privet bearing my name. So we are very, very careful with what we do with our seed. And I will mention, if you don't mind, part of my job is evaluation of these plants. And so over the past year, since we have not been able really to travel this year at all, we